Hey everyone, I'm Howard Pinsky, and in this Adobe XD tip, I'm going to show you how to create a toggle switch using components and states. On this design, let's assume for a moment that inside of this section here, the settings section, you want to create a switch so that your users and testers can turn these different private, explicit filters, friends activity on and off. So what we're going to do, we're going to grab the rectangle tool from the tools bar on the left, and we're going to start creating our first toggle switch. So I'm going to just draw out a shape that looks like that, right? Looks great. Except it doesn't look that great just yet. So we're going to make a few stylistic changes. First off, we're going to round out the corners, and that can be done very easily by grabbing one of the handles on the inside and pulling this on in, right? Next thing we want to do, because this will be the off state, we want to change the background color to a more neutral color. White is okay, but if we drop it down to about gray, somewhere right about there, it'll give the impression that this switch is off. We can also give it a very subtle border, just like that, right? To help separate it from that white background. Perfect. Now, the last thing we want to add is the actual toggle switch. So I'm going to grab my ellipse tool, I'm going to hold down my shift key and draw one out just like that. And you can zoom in here to really see what's going on to make sure that's the exact size that you're looking for, right? Just like that. We can even make it a little bit bigger. I'm holding down Alt or Option and Shift and boop, just like that. Now I can move it on over to the left, which will be where the off position is. Now for this one, all we have to do is just turn off the border and we've got a nice switch. You can also, if you want to, add a bit of a shadow, or you can turn that border back on and have a little subtle shadow just like that, right? Completely up to you. But because this is the off switch, it doesn't have to be too fancy. We're going to leave it as is. All right. So we've got our off state created, but now we want to make sure to turn this into a component so we can actually set up the interaction. So with both of these shapes selected, I'm going to hold down my shift key and click on the non-selected shape. Over in the properties inspector to the right, we're going to press the plus button. You can also do this inside of your libraries panel in your assets section. You can press the plus button there, but I'm going to go ahead and press it over in the properties inspector only because we want to now create an additional state, which can be done using that same plus button. So I'm going to go ahead and press new state. I'm going to name this on, just like that. And now that the state has been created and is active, all we need to do is hop in here and just shift this over and then change the background color. I have some great colors inside of my assets right here. So I'll go ahead and shift this to, let's say, a nice purple. We can turn off the border if you want to. There's a nice amount of contrast, so it looks pretty good. And now if I press escape to go to the parent level of this component, we've got our on state and our off state, right? Which is great. But we want to make sure that we can cycle between these when previewing this prototype. So I'm on my default state. I'm going to go into the prototype mode right here at the top. And since I want users to tap on this trigger, I want to just simply click on the blue handle to the right. This will allow me to choose a destination state within the properties inspector. It's going to automatically default to auto animate. And of course, you can change the easing options down below. Let's go for a nice snap. And we'll do a very quick duration. Let's try 0.4. We may go back and change that, but we'll start with 0.4. And then we can go to our on state, do the exact same thing. Click, and then choose our default state, which is off, right? All right, so now at the very top right-hand corner, we can launch the preview, and then we can click, and we can click, just like that. Now, of course, if you needed to, you can make some additional changes. So I'm taking a look at that. You know, when I look at the preview, it looks a little bit too long. So all I need to do is go into my default state on the main component and just shift this inwards a little bit to make it a little bit smaller, right? And you're going to notice it also, because I was editing the default state on the main component, it also changed my on state. So once again, click, click, on and off. Looks pretty good. Now, one of the cool benefits of wiring up the main component, which is this component here with the solid diamond, is that all of your instances are wired up as well. So if I wanted a few extra, let me zoom out. If I wanted a few extra of these toggle switches going down, right, all I have to do is either duplicate them, holding down Alt or Option, or I can also pop them into a repeat grid. So I can press the repeat grid option right here at the top, and then drag out 3 more. Adjust the spacing, And now if I press play one more time, I can toggle any of these switches on in no particular order. And now you have a functional toggle switch using Adobe XD. Hey everyone, I'm Howard Pinsky, and in this Adobe XD tip, we're going to take a look at building out animated charts using component states. Here's a dashboard I've been working on, and right in this area here, I want to add another module with some charts that we can toggle between today and week and have them animated. So first what I'm going to do, I'm going to dive into this group that I have set up. I'm going to grab my rectangle tool, shortcut key R, and drag one out right here. And you're noticing, because I have a stack enabled on this particular group and the parent group, everything below is pushing away nicely. Now, what I want to do next is grab the style from one of these other components and apply it to our newly created shape. So I'm going to hold down my Command or Control key to dive directly into one of these groups, Command or Control C to copy, or you can right click and press copy as well. Then dive back into this group, grab the newly created shape, right click, and then paste appearance. Beautiful. So now that we have our container created, we may want some elements inside of it to let us know what exactly we are looking at. Starting off simple, I'm going to grab the text tool, then type out something like weekly video views. And of course, if I need to make the text larger or smaller, I can do that within the Properties Inspector or simply pull on the handle right below. Great. Next up, we need to create our first chart. And to do that, I'm going to start with the Line tool over here in the Tools bar to the left, or the shortcut key L. For this, I'm going to hold down my Shift key to constrain it on a perfect horizontal axis and drag it across my container just like that. Now, in terms of the styling, we're going to go for a nice blue color. So I'm going to shift the color just like this. That looks pretty nice right there, and then increase the size quite a bit. Now, to give this a little bit more of a curvy feel, I'm going to go ahead and round out the caps right here as well, just like that. Perfect. So we have our first chart created and ready to go, but we need to add a few extra points so that we can push and pull them around. Now, to do that, very simple. We're going to head over here to the line. We're going to double click to access the path. Then I'm simply going to go through and add a few extra points, just like this. And that looks pretty good. Of course, I can move these around on the line so that they're a little bit more even from each other. And that looks pretty good right about there. Now at this point, if I were to simply grab any of these points and push them up or down, we're going to get a very sharp line. Now, of course, if this is what you're looking for, then continue onwards. But I want a little bit more of a curvy feel to this chart. So I'm simply going to go through and double click on each of these points, which is going to convert them into nice curves. And now when I go through and push and pull these lines just like that, we have nice curved charts. Just like that. Looks pretty good, right? Beautiful. Now, before we move on and talk about components, I may just want to actually create one more chart. So I have this one selected. I'm going to hold down my Command key and press the D key on my keyboard to duplicate. And for this one, we're going to go ahead and change the color to something a little bit more vibrant, something nice and reddish pink. And then I'm going to double click on this new path one more time and push and pull just like that, just so I have another chart. We can use this for different values or different, whatever it might be that you might be looking for. And there we go. Beautiful. Next up, we need to start thinking about how we're going to trigger the different views. And I'm thinking at the top right-hand corner, we can create a nice toggle switch. So once again, with the rectangle tool, shortcut key R, I'm going to drag one out just like this in the top right-hand corner. Move it into place. I'm going to round out the corners completely by grabbing this handle or any of the handles on the inside and whoop, dragging that on in. For the background of this container, I probably don't need a border, but I do want to set the fill color to a much darker color, something like that. And then we'll need one more element that acts as the actual toggle. So I'm going to duplicate this shape, Command and Control D, and then drag this side over to the middle. Now, of course, because it's the same color as the background right now, we can't really see it. So I'm going to hop over here to my Properties Inspector and just change the color to a nice, vibrant purple. Great. That's looking pretty good. Probably a little bit too small, but we will adjust that in a moment. Now, for the labels of these two views, we're going to press the T key on our keyboard, click, and then for this one, it's going to be today. I'm going to make this a little bit larger. Just like that. And the one over to the right, I'm going to hold down my Alt or Option key and drag over, and this will be week. Now, of course, we definitely need to make this a little bit larger. So I'm going to click on the toggle switch and the background, holding down Shift, and then drag this out a little bit just to make both of them a little bit larger. And then, just like that, that looks pretty good. I can move these into place so we have our toggle switches looking pretty nice. And with those done, I'm going to dive in here one more time, select all these elements. You can also do that in your layers panel to the left, Command and Control G to group them, and I'm going to call this toggle, just to keep everything nice and organized. Perfect, so we have our chart complete, and now what we want to do is turn all of this into a single component so we can start working on the various states. So within the layers panel, I'm going to go ahead and make sure to select all these elements just like this. And either within the Properties Inspector to the right or the Command and Control K shortcut or within your assets, I'm going to press the plus button up here to create our component. And this will give us our default state, which is our today view. And because we did the work already to create this view, we don't have to do anything else. And we can move on to creating our next state by pressing the plus button right here and pressing New State. And this one is going to be called Weekly. Now, with the new state created and active, all we need to do now is dive into our component and make the changes. So I'm going to grab the toggle switch, shift it on over, maybe make it a touch smaller because the word week is a little bit smaller. And now, just like we edited the charts earlier, I'm going to dive in, double click, and make some changes just like this. Move this one down as well. Maybe I'll bump this one up, that one too. Sure, why not that one as well? Then I'm going to double click on the blue and move these around just like I did with the red chart just a moment ago. There we go, that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to press the escape key to go back to the parent of this component. And now if we look over to the right, we have our default state and our weekly state. And we can toggle between the two to see exactly what they all look like. But of course, we want to make sure that we can interact with this when the prototype is previewed. And to do that, we're going to hop into prototype mode right here at the top. And we want to start by selecting the element that we want to trigger the next state. And in this case, we're going to double click to dive into this component, select the week text layer, and simply click on the blue handle to the right. This will allow us to choose a destination state within the Properties Inspector. We're going to choose the weekly state. It's going to automatically default to auto animate, which we do want so the toggle and the charts animate beautifully. And then for the easing options, I'm thinking maybe a nice snap should look nice, and maybe 0.6 seconds. And now that this one is set up, we can press escape one more time to go back to the parent, go to our weekly state, and do the exact same thing to toggle back to our today. Click. Choose the destination state within the Properties Inspector. The rest of the properties remain the same, so all we have to do now is press the play button right at the top, click to toggle today, and click to toggle week. And that's an overview on how to create animated charts using component states in Adobe XD. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all in the next tip. Hey everyone, I'm Howard Pinsky, and in this Adobe XD tip, we're going to take a look at creating an expanding card using masks and components. On this project here, I'm building out a Behance profile, and what I want to happen is when this object here is clicked on or tapped on, it expands, showing more information. And here's how that's done. So I've already started the process of building out the basic card, right? I have a rectangle and I have some text. Nothing too fancy. We left it pretty simple for you. And to fill this card in, I'm going to hop over to Finder or Windows Explorer, grab an image, and simply drag it directly into Adobe XD to mask that image on top of that card. In terms of the text, we need to make a few changes. First off, I'm going to double-click and change the title to match the project. In this case, it is the Boop Cast Podcast Application Design. Now, because the text is white and some of the elements behind it are also white, we may want to add a little bit of a shadow behind it. So in the Properties Inspector, scrolling down a little bit, I'm going to go to Shadow. I'm going to bump up the blur quite a bit so it's not too harsh, and then maybe increase the opacity just a touch. I can also experiment with the position of this particular title. Or if I really want to make sure that it's seen, I can add a little bit of a gradient behind it. So if I select this image here, I can Command and Control D to duplicate it. And then over to the right, we'll want, instead of a solid color, we'll want to change this to a linear gradient. And both colors are going to be set to black. So the top color set to black and the bottom color set to black as well. But on the bottom color, we'll actually want to grab the opacity slider to the right and just bring it all the way down just like that. And if we do want to make sure that some of the top can be seen as well, we can bring down the opacity like that, just so we have the text a little bit more visible. Beautiful. Over to the left, I'm going to rename this Gradient. All right, so the initial card is now set up, but what we also want to do is mask all the elements that will not be seen initially. And what I'm thinking is when this is tapped on, a white rectangle will appear to hide all the other information behind it. So I'm going to grab the rectangle tool, shortcut key R, and simply drag one out from the top all the way down to the navigation bar at the bottom, just like that. And I'm going to make sure that it's currently behind the elements that we want visible. Great, so now that we have the container ready to go, we can start building out some of these other elements. Now, right above the image, I may want a little bit of a profile photo. So I'm going to grab my ellipse tool, shortcut key E, drag one out just like this, put that into place. Now, I actually do have a profile photo right here, so I can dive in here, select this particular image, copy it, grab this ellipse, and then paste the appearance. Next, over to the right, we need a name. Howard Pinsky. I'm not going to get too fancy with the styling, but I will darken the text just a little bit and then move it on into place. Next, since this card will be blocking all the other information, we'll need a way to also dismiss it. And to do that, I'm thinking at the top right-hand corner, there's going to be some sort of an X. So with the ellipse one more time, I'm going to drag one out, holding down Shift to constrain it. Change the fill color to a nice dark color, just like that. And then maybe on the inside, if I zoom in here a little bit, I'll simply grab the text tool and type out the letter X. Make it nice and bold, and put it into place. Now, what you might be noticing is that this particular X is a little bit sharp, and you may want a different style for your close buttons. So there are a few things you can do in this case. Let me go ahead and delete this. First thing you can do is you can grab a line, drag one out, change the color to white, increase the size a little bit, round out the caps, and then simply rotate it 45 degrees. And once that one's done, Command and Control D to duplicate, you can flip it right in the Properties Inspector, and now you have a much more attractive looking close icon. One more thing you can do, we'll get to this a little bit later, is you can go down to your plugins panel and use a plugin like Icons for Design. Type out close, and you have a variety of icons you can use directly on your project, but we'll get to more icons in just a moment. Another thing we may want to add when this card is expanded is a little bit of a description underneath the actual photo. So I'm going to grab the text tool, and with the text tool, I'm going to drag out a box across my document, just like that, snaps nicely into place, and I could go ahead and manually type everything out, but I'm a little bit too lazy, and I have some copy already, so I'm simply going to paste some into place, change the color to a much darker color, and then play around with the styling a little bit. I do want to drop the size, let's say to around 16. Let's drop the weight as well to maybe regular. Let's center this. Maybe I'll bump it back up to 18 and adjust the line height a little bit as well. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Now the final thing I want to add is another icon that users can tap on to appreciate the post. So to do that, I'm going to grab my ellipse tool one more time, draw one out just like that. I'm going to change the fill color to this nice blue that we've been using so I can grab my eyedropper tool or check within my assets to see if I have that one saved. I do, so I can simply click on that. Now, I have my ellipse created. We need another icon. So back within our plugins down here at the bottom, this time I'm going to type out thumb. And there are a lot of different thumbs we can probably use, but I'm going to go ahead and choose the iconic thumb right there, pop that into place, and change the fill to white. Perfect. All right, so at this point, we have all of our elements designed, but of course, things are looking a little bit messy and all over the place. So what we want to do is mask out the elements that we don't want seen initially. So hopping over to my layers panel, Command and Control Y, I want to first start by organizing some of these layers. I'm going to group these, call this one thumb. I'm going to make sure to group these elements up here for the close icon, Command and Control G, close. The description's probably fine on its own. I will select these two and put this into a group called user. All right, so now that things are a little bit more organized, what we want is to define our mask. And to make that process very simple, we're going to use the same shape that we're using for the actual image. So I have this layer here selected. I'm going to Command and Control D to duplicate. And I'm going to name this mask so we can tell the difference. And I'm going to drag this up to the top. And I want to make sure that this is the layer at the very top of all the other elements that we're going to mask out. And with that done, I'm going to make sure that's selected. Hold down my Shift key and click on the last layer in this group, which is that white background layer that we're going to be using. So if I move these around, you're noticing all of these layers are now selected. And with that done, under the Object menu, you will see the Mask with Shape option, but I did this on purpose. You're going to notice it's currently grayed out, and I'll tell you why it's currently grayed out. It's because that layer that we duplicated currently has a mask already because there's an image inside of it. So in that case, all you have to do is just change that to some other color, doesn't matter what color, and then repeat the process. So you have the mask layer selected, hold down Shift, click on that last layer, and if there are any groups or layers that should not be selected, like this navigation bar, simply hold down your Command or Control key to deselect it. Now, back under the Object menu, we're going to go ahead and choose Mask with Shape, which is going to take all those elements that are outside of that container that we selected as the mask and mask them very nicely. I'm going to go ahead in the Layers panel and name this Boopcast. Great. Now at this point, we're ready to start creating our component. You can do this from your Assets, Command and Control K, or over to the right within your Properties Inspector, hit the plus button to create your default state. And now that that's been created, and we've already done the work to create our initial view, we can go ahead and right away create an additional state. And I'll call this Expanded. And with the new state created and active, what we want to do now is dive into our component, dive into the mask, and you're going to notice that you can kind of see some of the elements that have been masked out, but they're not very visible. They're a little bit grayed out. And to make those visible, you want to select the mask layer, which is selected right now, and simply enlarge it. So I'm going to move that on up, hold down Alt or Option, drag these out, move this down to the navigation bar, and then unround out those corners by grabbing one of the circles and dragging on out. So now that the mask is enlarged, anything within this area is going to be visible. So we can start making some changes. I can select this user, for example, move it on up. Maybe to unobstruct this image, I can move up the text as well. Now, because it's white on white, we need to make a few small tweaks. So in the Properties Inspector, I'm going to darken this layer a little bit and turn off the shadow. I'll also move it over to the left so it snaps with our guide. Now, in terms of the image, we probably don't need the gradient, but I'm going to go ahead and move these up a little bit and then select just the gradient and reduce the opacity down to 0. Next, I can select the description and move it on up as well. And that's looking a little bit better. The final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select this image and let's go ahead and make it the full width of this container and unround out the corners as well. So we've now gone ahead and created our expanded state. We have our default state and we have our expanded state. And now what we want to do is to be able to trigger between both of them. And that is all done within prototype mode right here at the top. And since I'm okay with having any of the elements used as a trigger, I'm simply going to select the entire component, click on the blue handle over to the right, and then within the Properties Inspector, we can choose our destination, which is our expanded state. In terms of the easing options, ease in and out is pretty good. Snap might work as well, so we'll go ahead and choose that with a duration of around 0.6 seconds. And before we move on to the next state, let's go ahead and preview to see what this is looking like. So with the play button right at the top, I'm going to launch that, move this over a little bit, click. That's looking pretty good. It may be a little bit too slow, so let's go ahead and just drop this down to about 0.4. And now what we can do, we can go to our expanded state, select our close icon, click on the handle, choose the destination, the default state, which is our collapsed view. We'll keep the same properties. And now we can go back to our default state, play one more time, click, and then click again to close. And that is an overview on how to create an expanding card using Adobe XD, components, and states. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all in the next tip. Hey everyone, I'm Howard Pinsky, and in this Adobe XD tip, I'm going to be showing you how to design out a music player for your audio-based applications. On this project here, I'm working on a podcasting app, and I may want to add a few additional elements to this screen, specifically the progress of how much the audio has played, and a few icons down at the bottom, including play and pause. So, starting off at the top with the progress indicator, I'm thinking to keep things fairly simple, I want a border going around the outside, and then a thicker border right around here showing how much of the audio has played. Now, since I already have an ellipse in place, I'm actually going to use this to start the process. So selecting this shape, I'm going to duplicate it with Command and Control D, and then enlarge it from the center, holding down Alt Option and Shift and scaling up. Now, of course, I don't want the fill in this case, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off in the Properties Inspector, and then turn a border on. Now, for this first border, this is going to be the inactive part of the audio. So I'm going to decrease the size quite a bit, somewhere around 5 pixels looks pretty good. And then I want more of a toned down value, so I'm going to grab the eyedropper beside border and sample this color here to start. That looks okay, but it's still a little bit too rough. So I'm going to grab the color picker and set it somewhere right around there. Perfect, I think that'll do. The next border we want to add is one to indicate how much of the audio has played, which will go from around here down to around here. And just like we did with the first border, we can use this shape to help us out by duplicating it with Command or Control D, and then back within my layers, I'm going to make sure they're both named. Alright, so for this border, there's a few changes we want to make. One, we need to change the color. And for this one, I'm thinking we can probably pull from the album artwork. So again, grabbing the eyedropper, I'll just grab this color right here, and that should do. The second thing we want to do is probably make this border a little bit thicker. 15 might be a little bit too much, so let's drop it down to around 10. And then finally, we want to make sure that it's not covering the entire circle. And that's when you can start experimenting with your dashes and your gaps. So in this case, I'm thinking a 210 with 830 might work pretty well. Now, of course, those numbers will change based on the size of your ellipse, so definitely experiment with these values. Now that I'm looking at this, we might need a few additional changes. One, I might want to round out the caps to give it a nice fluid feel. And then two, at the moment, it's kind of poking outside of this other border. So to adjust that, I can either push the border on the inside or on the center. And then if necessary, I can always enlarge it just a touch to make sure it's straddling that border in the background perfectly. And now that I'm looking at this with the thicker border, I'm thinking the audio border in the background could be a little bit thinner. Perfect. Alright, things are coming along, but there's one more thing we want to add to this progress indicator, and that is a scrubber. So with my ellipse tool shortcut key E, I'm going to draw one out right around here, and then we'll want to work a little bit on the styling. And to match the rest of our design, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my eyedropper tool, shortcut key I, sample this color that we're already using right here, but of course we want to make sure that it doesn't clash too much with that scrubber. So, over in the border section, I'm going to change the color to white and make it quite a bit thicker. And if you find that the white stands out a little bit too much, grab the eyedropper tool and sample the background, but you're going to notice that definitely blends in a little bit too much. And that's when you can start utilizing subtle drop shadows. So with that turned on, I'm going to up the blur just a little bit and then jump into the shadows color picker and decrease the opacity just a touch. So we have a nice subtle shadow. Perfect. And with that, the progress indicator is now complete. And in my layers panel, I'm going to make sure to grab these elements and put them into a group. Now, panning down a little bit, right in this section here, we want to add a few icons. Download, play forward, backwards, play, and maybe even leave a comment. And to help us out, we can very easily utilize a plugin. So hopping into my plugins panel down at the bottom left-hand corner, I do have the Icons for Design plugin installed, where I can start searching for the icons of my choice. And the first one will be Download. There are definitely a lot of options here, but let's go ahead and choose the awesome download icon, just like this, and we'll pop this into place right about here. Next, we might want an icon to go back. So I'll type in back. And this icon from Awesome as well looks pretty good. Pop that there. And I would imagine we would want one to go forward as well. So I'm going to duplicate this, hold down Alt or Option, drag it over to the right, and then within my Properties Inspector, simply flip it. Next, over here to the far right, we might want an icon to comment. So I'll go ahead and type out, let's say, message, and the material icon looks okay. And then finally, right in the center, we may want a play or pause button. And for this one, we'll design it ourselves. So with the ellipse tool shortcut key E, I'm going to drag one out, holding down my shift key to constrain it to a perfect circle. In terms of the fill, I'm thinking maybe we can grab this color right up here to start. Probably don't need a border. And then in the center, we need either our play or pause button. Now in this case, the music or audio might be playing, so we'll start with a pause icon. And for that, it can very easily be created using two rectangles. So I'll draw one out, again, shortcut key R. I'm going to go ahead and round out the corners ever so slightly. I can grab this handle right here, or you can do it within the Properties Inspector as well. And then duplicate one over to the right. Selecting both of them with the Shift key, I'm going to make sure that they are centered. Looks like I need to bump one of them over, and there we go. Zooming on out. It's looking a little bit thick, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to revisit this a little bit, bring this in as well. I'm holding down Alt-Option to make sure to scale from the center. Let's drop this down to 1 for the rounded corners, and let's try one more time. That's looking a little bit better. Now, hopping into my Layers panel, I do want to make sure to select all these elements, group them, Command and Control G, and then call this Pause. Great. Now looking at these other icons compared to the play and pause button, they might need a little bit of tweaking. So one thing I want to do is make them a touch smaller. I'm going to go ahead and select all these icons, holding down my Shift key, and just scale them down a touch. So I'm holding down Shift one more time and just scaling it down just like that. And of course I can drag this out, and responsive resize does its thing, making sure they're nicely spaced. And finally, to better match our design, we may want to sample one of the other greens. So I'm going to grab the eyedropper with all the icons selected, and let's try this green right up here. And of course, if you had this color saved in your assets, you can use that straight from there. And that's looking pretty good. I'm going to move these up so it lines up with the pause button. Make sure the pause button is nice and centered. And then what I'll want to do is in my Layers panel, just to make sure everything's nicely aligned, is select all of these icons and then hit the Distribute Horizontally button at the top right-hand corner. There we go. And one more time, I'm going to go ahead and group these elements and call this Player. And if I now launch the preview at the top right-hand corner, we now have our completed design with a progress indicator at the top and our icons of choice right here. And as I've covered in many of my tips, you can also utilize components and states to really customize this music player down at the bottom, to add interactions and a whole lot more. So that is how you design out a music player using Adobe XD. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all in the next tip. Hey everyone, I'm Howard Pinsky, and in this Adobe XD tip, I'm going to be showing you how you can use components to keep your presentations up to date. On this project here, I've been working on this coffee application, and I'm at the stage where I may want to present my work to my clients, friends, or stakeholders. But what I don't want to do is every time my design changes, I'd have to go back and change the presentation as well. So let's start off by setting up the presentation artboard. I've already gone ahead and set up the presentation artboard, but what I want to do now is add in an image. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool from the tools bar and drag one out across the entire artboard. And then once that's in place, I can hop over to Finder or Explorer, and I've got this great looking shot right over here. I'm going to drag directly onto the shape. Great, so now that the image is in place, what I want to do is create some sort of a device frame. So once again, with my rectangle, I'm going to draw one out just like this, which is the approximate size of an iPhone. And of course, if you have specific dimensions that you're working with, you can enter those to the right within the Properties Inspector. Now to make it look a little bit more like a device frame, I'm going to round out the corners quite a bit, and then what we'll want to do is cut out an area in the middle for the screen. So duplicating the shape with Command and Control D, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to change the color just so I can see it against the white shape in the background. Then I want to start bringing this inwards on all sides, just like this, the top and the sides as well. I am holding down my Alt-Option key to scale from the center. Now, if you look closely, the new shape that we just created, the rounded corners, even though they're the same value, it looks a little bit off. So what you'll want to do when you scale a shape inwards is just bring those corners out just a touch to line up with the shape in the background. Perfect. That looks pretty good. So now that our frame and screen have been created, what we want to do is use this newly created shape to knock out a hole in the shape behind it. So in the Layers panel, I'm going to make sure to select both of those layers just like that. And in the top right-hand corner, I'm going to choose the Subtract Boolean option, which, just like I mentioned, will cut a hole through to the background. And what's great about working with Boolean objects is that all the layers still remain editable. So once we go ahead and bring over this design, if the device frame is a little bit off, which looking at it, it probably is, we'll definitely be able to make some tweaks. All right, so now that the frame is ready to go, we want to start bringing this design over. And like I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be using components to do that. So what I want to do is in the Layers panel, I'm going to select every single layer that makes up this design. And then once that's been selected, you can either right-click, press Make Component Do it from the Properties Inspector to the right or your Libraries panel. A lot of different ways to make a component. But once you do that, this is going to be the main component for this particular design. So any instance we may have on our document can be kept up to date. And now that this has been created, I can simply copy it to my clipboard, Command and Control C, hop over to my presentation artboard, and paste it into place. And there we go. I'm going to go ahead and move it behind our device frame. I should probably do a better job at naming these layers. I'll call this Device and App. And as you can tell, the device frame is definitely a little bit off. So I'm going to go ahead and just enlarge this a touch and pull it outwards ever so slightly. Now, in terms of the styling of this device frame, probably don't need a border, but I am going to change the color of the frame very so slightly. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow and orange in there. Again, very slight, just like that, just to kind of match the aesthetic of the rest of the app. And depending on your personal preference, you may want the corners of the device frame rounded or not rounded. So you can always dive in here, double click into the Boolean object, round out those corners a little bit more, and you'll want to do the exact same thing for the screen layer as well, just so they match up. Now, what you might be noticing if you look very closely, some of the application is popping out in the background. Now, there are two ways to deal with that. You can either dive into that component, select the background layer, and then bring in those shapes, but you may have several shapes up there that need rounded corners. And depending on the layers you're working with, you might not be able to round out those corners. So in that case, you may want to utilize a mask. And to do that, we can use some of the shapes we've already been using. So inside of this Boolean object, I'm going to copy the topmost shape, which is the shape we've been using for the screen. I'm going to copy that and then paste it outside of the Boolean object and move it on top of my component. And once I have that in place, I'm going to select the screen layer and the component, and then under the object menu, we can choose Mask with Shape. That'll just ensure that any element that's popping outside of the screen will now be nicely contained within it. Perfect, so now that we have our device frame and our component in place, our presentation is looking great. But of course, the big benefit of using components is that this presentation can always be kept up to date. So if I'm working on the design over here on this artboard, I don't have to worry about making the changes twice. I can simply dive into this component, move my layers around, and you're noticing it's also making those changes on this artboard here. So if I decided I want to change the color of this button, I simply have to dive in, go to the color picker, and make the change. And that's that, using components to keep your presentations up to date in Adobe XD. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all in the next tip.